The conference room on the 27th floor had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the lake, and on clear days you could see all the way to the gardener. It was not a clear day. It was November, overcast and flat, and the lake was the color of old pewter, and my manager was standing at the front of that room, clicking through slides as I had spent 4.5 months building. My slides, my language, my risk matrix, my three-tier rollout structure, even the small note I'd added in the appendix about provincial compliance thresholds. A detail specific enough that I'd half expected to be asked about it. My manager had been asked about it. She answered smoothly. She'd read it carefully enough to answer smoothly. I was sitting 4 chairs down on the right side of the table. I had been included in the meeting as a supporting resource, not a presenter. I held my pen lightly against my notepad and I watched, and I said nothing, because I had already made a decision about how this story would end. And that decision required me to do absolutely nothing for a very long time. My name is Isla. I was 32 years old then, and I had been a senior analyst at Hartfield Strategy Partners for 3 years, working out of our offices on King West in downtown Toronto. Hartfield was not a large firm, 60-some consultants across 2 floors, most of our work concentrated in the institutional sector. Pension funds, crown corporations, federal agencies, and the data and reporting sides of a few of Canada's big 6 banks. It was the kind of place where reputation moved fast in both directions. Do good work, quietly and consistently, and the right people noticed. Make an error in judgment, and you felt it in every meeting for the next 2 quarters. I had built a reputation for the former. 3 years of clean deliverables, on time and usually under budget, on engagements that other analysts had flagged as complicated. I didn't have a loud presence in the office. I didn't work the room at Friday drinks or linger in the kitchen for the kind of conversations that are really about being seen. I showed up early, I worked carefully, and I produced things that held up under examination. My manager was a woman named Cecily. She had been with Hartfield for 11 years, which in consulting terms is long enough to have outlasted 2 different managing partners and at least 3 complete shifts in the firm's strategic direction. She was capable. I want to be fair about that, because fairness matters, and I've had enough time to think clearly about who she was. She was capable, polished, and exceptionally good at one specific skill that has nothing to do with the actual work of consulting. She was good at being in the room when good ideas landed. She had a talent for absorbing what other people had built and presenting it upward in a way that felt like her own synthesis. It had served her well for 11 years, until it didn't. The project I had spent 4.5 months building was a client data integration framework for a large Ontario pension administrator. Our firm had won the engagement on a proposal that promised to consolidate 7 separate legacy reporting systems into a single auditable platform, fully compliant with provincial regulatory standards. The contract value was $3.2 million. I was not named on the proposal. My manager was. What followed the win was what I had quietly expected. The proposal team handed off, and the actual work landed on me, as it usually did with engagements of this kind. I did not resent that. I'm good at implementation, and the problem itself was genuinely interesting. 7 systems, 2 of which dated from the early 2000s, running on infrastructure that the client's own IT team had stopped fully understanding years before. Threading the data flows across all of them without disrupting the client's quarterly reporting cycle was the kind of puzzle I found, if I'm honest, satisfying. I worked evenings. I worked Saturday mornings in my apartment in Mississauga before the building's other residents were awake, with coffee going and the city quiet outside the window. I ran my own validation tests. I cross-referenced the architecture against the client's technical documentation and caught 3 inconsistencies the original proposal had missed. I built a phased rollout plan with embedded risk checkpoints at every stage, and a clear governance structure that assigned accountability at each milestone. It was the most thorough work I had ever produced. I knew that when I finished it, in the particular undemonstrative way you know things you've worked hard enough to be certain about. I brought it to my manager on a Thursday morning. I had emailed her the full deck the night before, and she had asked, in her response, if I could walk her through the methodology in our one-on-one. She wanted to be able to field questions from the partners, she said. We sat in her office for just over an hour, the November light gray through the windows, and I explained each layer of the framework while she asked questions and took notes in the precise, attentive way she always did when she was learning something she planned to use later. "Let me sit with this before we take it upstairs," she said when we were done. She sat with it for 4 days. On the following Monday, she presented it to the partner group at a meeting I was not invited to attend. I found out from Amara. Amara was a fellow analyst, one of the few people at Hartfield I trusted completely. And she had been in the back of the room adjusting the projector when the meeting started, and had not been able to leave without making it obvious. She sent me a Teams message that said only, "Coffee, not the office kitchen." We walked to the second cup on King Street, and she told me everything. My manager had presented the data integration framework as her own strategic analysis. She had used my exact language, I know, because I wrote those slides and I remember the specific words I chose when I was writing them. She had described the 3-phase rollout structure as her approach. She had fielded questions about the provincial compliance thresholds, my footnote, without missing a beat. The partners were impressed, Amara said. She wrapped both hands around her cup and looked at me steadily. Really impressed. One of them called it the most rigorous thinking the practice has produced in 2 years. I drank my coffee. Outside, the November wind was pushing leaves against the glass. I said, "I know." "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Nothing yet," I said, and I meant it completely. My manager was promoted to managing director within 3 weeks. A new title and a compensation adjustment that, based on what I understood about Hartfield's salary bands, represented something in the range of 20% above her previous salary. She sent the practice an announcement thanking the team for their collective support. She did not mention my name. She passed my desk the afternoon the announcement circulated. "This kind of visibility at the partner level helps everyone on the team," she said. She was holding her coffee mug with both hands the way she always did when she wanted to appear open and collegial. "These things have a way of lifting all of us." I looked up and said, "Congratulations, Cecily." I said it evenly, without any particular coloring, and she nodded and moved on. I did not go to HR. I did not send a pointed email. I did not let myself linger in conversations with colleagues that could have tipped into venting. What I did do, starting that same evening, was methodical and quiet and took me less than 2 hours to complete. I went through my email archive, my team's messages, and the shared drive, and I saved everything. Every draft I'd emailed to my manager. Every thread in which she'd asked me to walk her through the methodology. The full version history from the shared folder, with timestamps on every file. I downloaded it all to a folder on my personal OneDrive and labeled it, without any ceremony, Q4 Project Notes. Then I kept working. I want to be honest about what that period was like, because I think honesty means not simplifying it. On the GO train home some evenings, watching Mississauga come up out of the dark, the suburban lights spreading out from the tracks, I felt something that didn't have a clean name. It was in the same neighborhood as grief and anger, but wasn't quite either. It was the specific ache of doing your best work, and watching it disappear into someone else's trajectory, and smiling in hallways, and saying nothing. I am not going to claim that was easy. I will say that I understood precisely what the cost of the alternative would be. Going directly at my manager would hand her the narrative. I would become the difficult one, the one who couldn't handle not getting credit, the one who didn't understand how teams worked. I had watched that story play out for other people at the firm. I was not going to become a chapter in it. There was one afternoon, about 4 months in, when I came very close. I had passed my manager in the corridor outside the boardroom and heard her describing the integration methodology, my methodology, to a junior consultant who was asking about his professional development. She was explaining it as though it had come to her fully formed, as though the logic were so natural it barely needed articulating. I stood just outside the conversation's edge, and for a long moment I felt the words arranging themselves. I didn't say them. I walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and stood at the window looking out at the city until the impulse passed. I've thought about that moment a lot in the years since. It was the closest I came to making the wrong choice. I kept my folder, I kept delivering, I waited. My manager's new role came with a new flagship engagement. A comprehensive data governance overhaul for a federal crown corporation, an 18-month project that the firm branded internally as the Horizon Initiative. The engagement value was $4.1 million. 11 consultants reported into the project structure. She did not put me on the team. I noticed that. I understood what the absence meant. Over the months that followed, I heard things. Hartfield was not a large firm, and the walls between practice groups were permeable in the way that walls between groups of competitive, observant professionals always are. A senior consultant named Roland, who was on a partner track trajectory and who I respected partly because he said very little unless he meant it, told me over coffee in the path one afternoon that the Horizon project was behind schedule in ways that were becoming difficult to explain. A Q2 deliverable had been pushed to Q3 and then again, quietly, toward Q4. An external vendor from Montreal that my manager had brought in at considerable cost had produced work that the client's technical team didn't believe was compatible with their existing systems. There were, Roland said carefully, questions about how project status had been communicated upward to the partner group. Nearly $400,000 in vendor spend had never been properly accounted for against any approved scope document. I listened. I said, that sounds like a significant gap. Then I moved the conversation on. I didn't mention anything about my history with my manager, and Roland didn't ask. I think he was already forming his own picture. I kept building a reputation as the person who fixed things quietly and without drama. I said yes to engagements that other analysts passed on. I delivered. I stayed boring and reliable in the specific way that, inside a firm under pressure, eventually becomes its own form of currency. 14 months after my manager had walked out of the partner meeting with my framework and a new title, Roland called me directly. He was a managing partner by then, newly appointed, and he had never called me one-on-one before. He asked us if I could come to his office. He sounded the way people sound when they've been careful with words for a long time and are now past the point where care serves any purpose. I went. He told me the Horizon engagement was in crisis. The Crown Corporation client was 8 weeks from a formal review and threatening to escalate to the Treasury Board Secretariat. The underlying architecture of the project didn't reconcile. Several milestone reports had been logged as complete against criteria that had been quietly loosened from the original scope. He said that a number of people within the practice had mentioned my name as someone who understood consolidation frameworks at a depth no one currently on the project did. He didn't know yet what he was actually saying when he said that. I let a silence sit between us, not an uncomfortable one, just a pause long enough to mean something. Then I said, I'm glad to help, but I want to come in as project lead, not as a supporting resource, and I want that formalized in writing before I open a single file. I looked at him steadily. And there's something you need to know before we talk any further. He said, go ahead. I told him. I told him about the framework I had built. I told him the dates, the methodology, the specific documents. I told him about the one-on-one in my manager's office, and every email I had sent her in the weeks prior. I told him that the Horizon Initiative was built on a foundation I had designed 14 months earlier, and that I had the documentation to demonstrate that clearly. I spoke without anger, because by that point I was past anger. I was simply presenting facts to a person who needed them. He listened without interrupting, which was, I thought, to his credit. When I finished, he said only, can you send me what you have? Tonight, I said. That evening, I sent him a single email with a single attachment, a compressed folder containing the original framework files with full version history, every relevant email thread, the team's messages, and a 2-page chronological summary I had written plainly and without editorializing. No accusation, no emotional language. Just dates, files, and facts, arranged in the order they had happened. I had been waiting 14 months to send that email. When I finally did, it took me 11 minutes to write. My manager found out I had been made project lead before she found out why. She came to my desk the next morning. I remember the fluorescent light above my monitor had been slightly off color for a week, a maintenance issue no one had gotten around to fixing, and she sat in the chair beside my workspace as though I had invited her. I heard you're stepping into Horizon, she said. Her voice had a brightness in it that wasn't natural, the way brightness sounds when it's covering something that wants out. That makes a lot of sense. You've always had strong implementation instincts. I looked up from my screen. You told the partners it was your strategic framework, I said. 14 months ago, in the partner meeting. I wasn't in the room, but I had a very accurate account. She went still. People who are good at managing their expressions usually keep at least one layer of control in reserve. She lost it for a moment, just a moment, before she found her footing. Managing directors present the team's thinking, she said. That's the nature of the role. You presented my thinking, I said, specifically. using my words and my structural choices in a meeting I wasn't invited to attend. I kept my voice flat, not cold, just precise. I sent Roland the documentation last night. He has everything he needs to understand what happened. She stood up slowly. We could find a way to move past this, she said, quieter now, like colleagues, like professionals. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I stood up, picked up the folder that had been sitting on my desk since that morning, and said, Cecily, for 14 months I've been exactly as professional as the situation required. I'm going to go rebuild your project now. I walked past her and left her standing beside my chair. The Horizon files took me 2 days to fully audit. The foundation was sound. It was my foundation, after all, but the implementation was in poor shape. The Montreal vendor had delivered work that looked complete in isolation and fell apart under integration testing. Several milestone reports had been marked complete against criteria that had been quietly loosened from the original scope. The unauthorized vendor spend came to $387,000, distributed across 4 invoices, none of which had cleared the firm's standard engagement controls. I documented all of it before I raised it. I am, if nothing else, consistent. When I presented the findings to Roland, I was organized and brought everything in writing. He brought in the firm's internal risk officer. The formal review began within 10 days. My manager was placed on administrative leave before the review concluded. She resigned 4 weeks later, before the process finished. Roland told me afterward, quietly, in the way he told things, that she had tried to reframe the situation during the review as a misunderstanding about credit sharing and team attribution. The timestamps in the files I'd submitted made that framing impossible to sustain. I kept working. Amara told me over lunch in the food court, soup from the Vietnamese place near the corner of Adelaide that we both liked, that 2 of the junior consultants from the Horizon team had also left the firm quietly in the weeks after. People who had known the status reports were inaccurate and had chosen to say nothing at the time. I didn't comment on that. They had made their own choices in their own situations, and I understood, better than most, that those choices are rarely simple. You knew this would happen, Amara said. I knew that the documentation was solid, I said. I didn't know exactly what would follow. I didn't need to. She nodded. She stirred her soup. I kept waiting for you to say something, she said. For almost a year, I kept watching you in hallways and I kept waiting. I know, I said. I needed the ground to be ready first. I rebuilt Horizon in 10 weeks. With the Montreal vendor's work removed and replaced, and the governance structure realigned to the original scope, the project came together in a way it clearly hadn't before, because the underlying architecture had always been sound. It had just been implemented by people who didn't fully understand what they were working with. We came in $230,000 under the revised approved budget. The client review was held in Ottawa in February, in a bright glass-fronted boardroom on the 7th floor of the Crown Corporation's head office. Deep cold outside, the kind of Ottawa February that makes the city feel purposeful and slightly punishing at the same time. The security check in the lobby had taken 20 minutes because of a technical issue with the visitor system. By the time we sat down, the client's team had the particular alertness of people who have been let down before and are watching carefully for signs that it might happen again. I presented the entire framework myself. No slides handed off, no sections deferred to supporting consultants. I stood at the front and walked through the architecture, the implementation logic, the governance structure, and the risk controls in my own words, under my own name. When the client's director of corporate systems asked a technical question about the data reconciliation methodology, I answered it in detail, because it was my methodology, and I had always known the answer. Afterward, in the lobby while coats were being collected, the client's VP of Transformation said to Roland and me that she thought the framework was the most rigorous consolidation architecture their organization had reviewed from an external firm. She shook my hand and held it a moment longer than necessary, the way people do when they mean what they're saying. Roland said something to me in the cab on the way back to the airport. He said, I owe you an apology. I should have looked more carefully at whose work that was 14 months ago. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. I said, you know now. And I left it there, because there was nothing else worth saying. In June of that year, I was named Director of Client Strategy at Hartfield, the youngest person in the firm's 24-year history to hold a director-level title. Amara texted me when the announcement went out. A single line, I always knew you would. I wrote back. Thank you for the coffee on King Street. She knew exactly what I meant. I still have the folder on my personal drive. Q4 project notes. I haven't opened it in a long time. There isn't any reason to anymore. What I carry from those 14 months isn't the folder, or the outcome, or even the specific satisfaction of having been right about waiting. What I carry is something simpler and harder to articulate. The understanding that doing excellent work, consistently and without requiring an audience for it, is not the same as doing nothing. It is, when done deliberately and with patience, the most active thing you can choose. It's an argument you build over time, in timestamps and deliverables, and a reputation that no one can pick up and walk out of a meeting with. Because it isn't attached to a single presentation or a single slide deck. It's attached to you. I've had junior colleagues ask me, in the years since, what they should do when someone takes credit for their work. The answer I give them is always the same. Document everything from the moment you suspect it might matter. Keep building things that are genuinely good. And don't confuse the moment you feel ready to move with the moment the ground is actually ready to hold you. The ground held. In the end, it always does, on its own schedule without you having to force it.